This is a short contribution from a palynological point of view of the recent Saharan Dust event that clouded European skies in the past few weeks. So dust events are actually quite common. This is an animated GIF of the Saharan dust that was blown into Europe now in mid-March. So Portugal and Spain were most affected. There were a few days which skies were really cloudy or dusty, let's say, but other countries in Europe were also affected by it. So you get the source area here in the Saharan desert, and the dust is blown off the Saharan desert into other regions. So in this, recently it happened that the dust was distributed over Europe, but actually more commonly, and this is an animation from another event that happened in 2020, where you get the Saharan dust being transported into the Atlantic and going right across it into Central America, sometimes reaching also the Amazon forests and also reach the US or North America. So this is quite common. It happens every year, has an important effect on fertilizing Atlantic waters, and you get a boom of organisms that are at the base of the food chain, and then from that you get considerable implications for the whole food chain in the marine realm. So these are quite commonly observed. We only are aware of them when skies become dusty and it's in the news and everything, but this is happening all the time, every year. This is a frequency chart of these dust events recorded in the Carpathian Basin, so in Central Europe, and you see there's a consistent events, these dust events in during April, and then also a bit during February and March, and then well into the summer. So this is for Central Europe. This is for different regions in Spain, where you see a peak of events in July and August, but they do occur in other times of the year. So this, you can analyze time series of this, and you'll see that this has been happening for several decades, and we can probably go back hundreds, thousands, and certainly millions of years where these dust events have been happening. So what is this dust? This is a view over Lisbon on March 15th. So usually you see beautiful blue skies over Lisbon, but that was not the case in this day and the day before and the day after, when the dust event happened. So you got this pinkish and orangish look everywhere, and there are other pictures of across Portugal and Spain where everything looked orange because of this dust. There was a bit of rain the following days, so you get this mud rain covering everything. This is how cars looked like in the days following the dust event. So I was curious about it and decided to take a sample. So from one of the cars, I took a bit of this dust. Please mind you, this is not a scientific study. This is just my curiosity of trying to understand what the dust contained. We mounted this on a simple glass slide, water mounts through, so very simple, and observed under the microscope. So most of the particles were these mineral grains, mainly quartz, then several others that I couldn't really identify. The surface seemed to be highly corroded or damaged, which is something that you see typically on these aeolian sediments. Most of it, the vast majority of the particles, were within the silt-sized range, so it was rare to see anything ranging into the fine sandstone, fine sand in this case. So they're all silts, from coarse to actually very fine silt. So in addition to the mineral particles, we started seeing some phytoclasts. In this case, it seems to be completely oxidized phytoclasts. So these phytoclasts are not more just plant remains, particles that are incorporated with the rest of the sediment and can be transported the same way as any other particle. Some of them were a little bit bigger because organic matter is not as dense as most mineral particles. They tend to be a little bit bigger than the mineral particles. But I was looking for something more, specifically pollen grains, and I did find them. These are Pinus pollen grains, so derived from pine trees. But I have to say I was a bit surprised of finding them here. So pine trees are typical of more temperate climates or even cold climates. So not really the typical pollen grains you expect from something deriving from the desert. So I looked up a bit more. Indeed, the pine tree distribution, you do get a bit of pine trees in northern Morocco, especially in the Atlas Mountains, but they're much more typical of more temperate climates, some Mediterranean climates as well, as you get in Europe. So I was a bit suspicious that these were actually derived from the desert. And sure enough, this is in Portuguese, but basically it's a pollen bulletin that is published every week, and these are from the days right after the dust event, mentioning that there's a lot of pollen in the air from different species, but one of them is precisely pine trees. So this supports my interpretation that these Pinus pollen grains were actually locally derived. I looked up a bit more on that, and there's a couple of papers that actually describe the correlation between these dust events and locally sourced pollen events. So in this case, they could, from data from Portugal and Spain, they could match these dust events here in red with increased pollen in pollen traps over the years. So either because dust events coincide with the flowering time of the year for many plants, or simply because there's more wind and pollen is more dispersed, you get this match of locally sourced pollen grains with these dust events. So you get actually a mix of the what is transported from the desert with the local contribution. So that's my interpretation, that these Pinus pollen grains were contributed locally. So what else is there? Some of these quartz grains or apparent quartz grain have funny shapes which are not that typical from what you expect of quartz grains to have, at least when they are transported by wind. And indeed some of them cannot be quartz grains. So these are actually phytoliths. So these are silica particles which are produced by different types of plants. The organic part of the plants is often not preserved, so it's just degraded away, but these silica particles tend to be preserved, at least more than the organic parts, and then they can be included with all the other particles and being transported by the wind. Also found these Acacia pollen grains. They were relatively common, and these are probably sourced from the desert or semi-desert regions. So if you look at where you find Acacia trees, they are more typical of the savanna, so the Sahel area here, so just south of the Saharan Desert proper. You do get them also in the northernmost part of Africa, in Morocco and Algeria. You also find them in Portugal and Spain, although I believe they are not native, at least not that many species are native to southern Europe, but they are not that common. There is no record in the pollen bulletins of Acacia pollen being especially present. So my interpretation is that indeed these Acacia pollen grains were transported from northern Africa, the Sahara, and possibly the Sahel into Europe. So some possible implications for biostratigraphy. Again, this is not a scientific study, just my curiosity and interpretation of what we might be interpreting wrong, or at least we should be more careful when interpreting the palynology of a stratigraphic sequence. So these dust events are more likely recorded in the marine realm. This is generally true for most sediments. So sedimentation is much more continuous when you are in the marine realm compared to terrestrial domains. Not everything gets preserved, of course, but generally they do get more easily preserved in the sea than onshore. In terrestrial settings, even if dust events are frequent, this fine dust cover will be likely washed away. That's exactly what we saw here in Portugal. We had a bit of rain in the days following. Of course, the initial rain was very muddy, but then the next rains were not that muddy and everything was washed away. There are notable exceptions to that. There are lowest deposits in different regions of the world where most of the deposition is caused by this dust transport, but usually these are deposited in very specific conditions. On the palynological side, the record of these events is probably more complex than just a mere transport of pollen grains from these desert or semi-desert areas into other regions. So, as we saw, there's consistent record of this, at least on a decade-long studies, that we see local microflora, so local pollen grains and eventually other organic particles mixed during these dust events. On the other side, or conversely, we should also be aware that the observation of these desert or semi-desert related pollen, and we can associate pollen grains with the type of plants, with the type of vegetation which can be typical of a desert. If we see that in the stratigraphic record, it doesn't necessarily mean that we are seeing a drier period. It may simply be representing a period with increased dust contribution. So you might be getting these pollen of plants which exist in desert regions, but they are not where you are observing them. They're just being transported from thousands of kilometers away into your sediment, and that's what you're observing. It's actually not getting drier, maybe it's just getting windier or dustier in your as you go over a stratigraphic sequence. So that's contribution from a palynologist on the recent dust event in Europe.